Make no mistake, being an entrepreneur is tough. You're trying to build a business, manage a team, deliver your product or service, and of course, make more money, all while trying to eat healthy and get to the gym, raise your kids, and maybe even make it to date night more than twice a year. So, when hustling harder doesn't work for you, how do you find the time, energy, and skills to build the business you want while being the parent and partner your family deserves? My name is Nick Murphy, and this is the Parentpreneur Podcast. Shelli Varela is a story alchemist and host of the Yes Effect and the It's a Tribe Thing podcast. The Yes Effect has been featured in Forbes and Entrepreneur magazine and has been listed among the top 18 must-listen-to female podcast hosts. In her business, Shelli helps people reframe their inner beliefs. Shelli, thanks for being here. I know we got a little bit of an issue. You're coming off of a surgery, so I appreciate you making time. We're going to have an amazing conversation.
Oh, no, I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate your flexibility, too.
No, it's going to be great. You are a story expert, and I think, before we talk about audience, one of the ways to create an audience is, in order to create an audience or build an audience, you have to actually connect with real human beings. And in this digital space, sometimes we forget that, we are really connecting with people just because we're using a webcam or a podcast tool or writing blog copy or our cell phones. There's still real people that need to engage in that story. And so I'm really excited to kind of kick off Audience Day with learning all about connection. So we'll touch on the mindset of that, how to find your story, how to craft your story, how to get comfortable with it, and then obviously the structure of a story so that you can create content in a way that actually engages your audience. Sound good to you?
Yeah, sounds amazing to me. Story's my jam, so I'm happy to share what I know. I'm happy to help and empower the people that are looking to use their story to serve their audience, spread their message, and sell not only their offering but themselves.
Amazing. Let's do that. So let's talk about the importance of story in creating connection. Story is as old as people, from the pyramids and other things where we drew on caves and all that stuff. How important is story just to human psychology in terms of creating connection and actually getting to know another person?
I think it's not even just important. I think it's vital. Our job as storytellers is to elicit emotion, whether that be excitement, whether that be curiosity, whether that be vulnerability. And really what we do is we hold up a magical mirror for our audience. And basically what we're telling them is, see, I'm just like you. And oftentimes when we tell a story properly, something truly magical happens in the minds of your audience. Like if you're able to show them how you're like them, then especially if you're willing to share some sort of vulnerability, and it doesn't have to be heavy and it doesn't have to be dark, but just share something of yourself, what you'll find happens is there is this sort of defense in your audience, and it exists in all human beings. But when you share vulnerability first, it actually softens that in your audience so that you can deliver your message to them, because now they're open to hearing it.
I love that. I want to touch on vulnerability because it's a topic that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people, depending on how vulnerable to get. So we're going to go there in a minute. But who are some examples, whether it's been clients you've worked with, your own story, people that we see in the market that you can point to that really do, in your estimation, a tremendous job of telling their story in an authentic way that creates connection with their audience?
Well, absolutely. I mean, obviously, in the online space, Stu McLaren is exceptional at stories, exceptional at sharing his story, sharing the stories and the successes of his amazing community, but also does it in a way that it allows that story to echo themselves within it. In terms of brands, Lululemon does a fantastic job. Other personal brands that do a great job of telling story and telling story incrementally in the way they speak and communicate. Obviously would be, we know that Oprah, she will share bits of her story that will allow her interview guests to open themselves up. And that's actually one of the secret sauce pieces of why people end up crying on the Oprah Winfrey stage, is because, they feel safe to do so, because not only does she create that safe space, but she also shares first. So she sets the tone of what that looks like.
Yeah, and Oprah's a great case study too, because for those of us that are old enough to remember the Oprah Winfrey show, it wasn't always what we remembered it today. It started out, in line with Jerry Springer, and he was selling kind of the same old stuff every other talk show was, like, you are not the father, and like, come have drama. And she sat, she sat back one day and took a stand and said, if I'm going to do this stuff, I'm going to do it around things that are positive, around things that I care about. And that's really when the trajectory of Oprah, as we know her today, took off.
Yeah, and the brilliance of Oprah, not only with respect to story, but how she weaves story into her interviews, is she'll always ask the next question. Oftentimes we feel uncomfortable going all the way with somebody, but she'll ask the question that we all have on our minds, and she's not afraid to ask it, but she's also not afraid to share first, so that, you know, she mimics and echoes what she wants that to look like. And in storytelling, we have the ability to do the same with our audiences as well, whether we're building businesses, well, whether we're speaking on a platform stage, a digital stage, it doesn't really matter. We have the ability to share first so that people can see themselves in our story.
So let's talk about that. There's a lot of people, you know, I've got 5 kids, and it wasn't that long ago where you're just trying to survive the day. You know what I mean? Like, you're running around, you're dropping kids off. There's preschool, there's diapers, there's pickup, there's dance classes, there's all these things. And I think it's really easy for busy parents to lose their story, or to actually believe that, you know, we don't have a story and nobody cares about our story if we can even find one. So before we get into how to find that story, what are some of the inner beliefs, the psychology that we need to shed, and those limiting beliefs that we need to get rid of in order to even share our story effectively in our business?
I'm so glad you asked. So when people think of story, oftentimes they think of quite simply just the story we're telling the world. And that's true. I consider that sort of the exhale portion of the story. I consider story like breath. So with respect to how we want to be known, our flag in the ground, what we stand for, what we stand against, that's the part of the story that everybody is, you know, working so hard to build so that we can build that business and be known. But the other half of the story that is, I would argue, not just equally important, but possibly more important, is the inhale part of the story. And so for us to tell the exhale part of the story and have the world know us in a specific way, we first have to look at, what do we think about ourselves? What do we believe to be true? The inhale portion of our story is what we believe is possible, what we believe isn't possible, any precognitive commitments that we've made from the time we were, you know, small children. My definition of story is a snapshot in time. It's our perspective in that snapshot and what we make it mean. And it's actually the meaning that drives the story. So with respect to your question, you know, I just think it's really important to ask ourselves, what do we believe to be true? Because oftentimes we will effort throughout life, and we're caught in the day-to-day grind and you know, to your point, getting the kids here and getting the kids there. But at the end of the day, what we have to do is take some time for ourselves and, you know, be able to listen to that inner voice. And it doesn't have to be a long time. But what it does actually for us as human beings is it resets and it recalibrates. So not only is it healthy for us, but it also gives us a second to take a breath and go, okay, you know, what do I need to do for myself right now to be able to have some clear thoughts and tune into how I'm feeling? Because storytellers, their job is to elicit emotion. So if we're going to communicate something to somebody else, we have to first be able to like tune into how we're actually feeling, what has truth and meaning to us. And so when it comes to, you know, the daily grind and the busyness and parentpreneurs, there's kind of two things. You know, oftentimes I'll hear my clients say, oh, you know, I don't have a story, or, you know, I'm just, you know, I'm so busy doing X, Y, and Z.
Right.
But there's two things. There's the feature, and then there's the benefit or the ripple effect. And so the feature is the what we're doing. So, you know, I'll make up a random example. If you're a parentpreneur who teaches business marketing, there's
Perfect.
the thing you do, business marketing, but then there's the ripple effect of what that causes, or the benefit. And so oftentimes I'll hear people focusing on the feature part of the story, like the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of what it is they do. But my encouragement to them is always to look 2, 3, 4 stages deeper to what does that actually mean? And what is the ripple effect of what you do? Like, what are you creating for the people you serve? And how are the people you serve then different so that they go out into the world and create more? And, you know, it really is important to tap into what we believe to be true and that inhale part of the story.
One of the words you mentioned earlier in the answer was perspective. And I think that we could drill into perspective and have this entire conversation around that, because the perspective that we have about what we're doing in our life, where our business fits in, where we're experts, where we can help people, where we can serve the best, is really dependent upon how deeply you want to look at it. And I think human nature, for better or for worse, a lot of people, especially early stage solopreneurs or parentpreneurs, are really hard on themselves about where their expertise lies, or why would they listen to me, or, oh, I'm not Lewis Howes, or I don't have the house on the hill, so therefore my story isn't important and won't inspire anyone. From a perspective standpoint, are there any exercises or kind of brain dumps that you can do to really kind of overcome your own perspective and then obviously create the Excel piece?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when it comes to perspective, so you use Lewis Howes as an example, and you could pick anybody. You could pick Marie Forleo. You could pick any of the quote unquote online gurus.
Yep.
All of those people underneath the fame and the success and the notoriety and the thousands of interviews they've done, at the beginning, at the root, if we trace it all the way back, there was a human being who had an idea, who probably had doubts and fears, who didn't know if it was going to work, who didn't have it all figured out, who said yes anyways. And that is the pinnacle, because most people are waiting to feel ready. They'll look at somebody like, you know, Lewis Howes or Marie Forleo or Oprah Winfrey, and they'll say to themselves, oh, you know, that's very inspiring. Their success is very inspiring, but I'm not like them. The important thing to realize is oftentimes, even now, they don't feel confidence and, you know, comfortable.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say comfortable. They probably feel comfortable at this point, but they don't necessarily feel as confident and fearless as we perceive them to feel. But for us, as we're starting out, we need to give ourselves permission to say yes and to make that decision. Because the truth is, you can't steer a parked car. You can't start journeying down the road and turn left or turn right or switch on the fly or make a correction if you don't ever start moving. And every great thing that it was ever done in the history of the world that was innovative or different started with somebody saying yes when they didn't have it all figured out. That's true of Elon Musk. That's true of Walt Disney. That's true of all of the people that we know who've created change. You know, Walt Disney was a guy who was the head of a sinking ship. And in the 11th hour, he puts his hand up and he's like, boys, I got it. It's a cartoon mouse. But think of that at the time, how ridiculous that must have sounded. There was no Disney World. There was no Disney movies. There was no Disneyland. It was one guy who puts his hand up in a room full of people who are staring at him with blank faces going, it's a cartoon mouse. But he knew what he knew like he knew it. And he didn't have it all figured out, but he said yes and he moved forward. And so for all of us who are waiting for that time when we feel like we're valid or we feel like we're worthy or ready, I just think we shouldn't be waiting for proof or evidence. The people that do, you know, the great work in the world started with shaky knees. They started without having it all figured out. And it's so important to just make a decision, do your best in the moment and move forward, because the next step will be revealed to you. And when it comes to perspective, the world just so needs what you have to offer. And it's that one thing. If you don't, it's literally lost for all time. And I just want to encourage everybody to know that we all have something super special to share. And story is literally the easiest way to do that. It's the easiest way to connect with your audience in a meaningful way so you can show them their gifts.
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody was a multimillionaire online until they were. Nobody was president of the United States until they won an election. Nobody was a parent until they had a child. Like, none of us have what it, you know, we don't know what it's going to be like to get to that next level until you actually get to that level. And in my story, you know, I played NFL football, and this was my experience. The bigger the people, like the Randy Mosses of the world that I played with, were the nicest, most humble, down-to-earth people. And you get to this point where you don't have anything to prove, but it's all about their story. And the story Randy would always tell us was, you know, if it weren't for football, I'd be working at McDonald's in West Virginia. And just talking about how grateful he was for the opportunity. But you've got to believe before you have evidence, before you have validation from the market, and really be that person in order to get and have the results that you want to have. So I think you hit it on the head, Shelli. This is kind of shifting gears real quick. Once we find that story, how much of it do we share? I've heard different components there. Like, are we super raw all the time? Is there, in your kind of philosophy, what's the perfect recipe to be vulnerable and authentic without being like, here's all the shit that's going on in my life, and
yeah, fair.
Buy my coaching program.
Yeah. Well, I have two kinds of stories that I sort of subscribe to. One, of course, would be your signature story, and that's your flag in the ground, and it's for how you want your audience to know you and connect with you, and the thing that you're known for, and the journey of how you got to be that person. But the second set of stories, I call them your story toolbox, and they're smaller, incidental, micro stories, and they're meant to inspire and make thoughts or concepts sticky, and they're meant to bust objections and lift people up and have people saying, oh, I never thought of it that way. So to answer your question, it really depends, because I believe the synergy of story, and synergy is when two things come together and they make a third thing that is not merely a combination of the two components, but a third and separate thing. That is what synergy is. And the synergy of a story is where the storyteller's inner and outer story come together, so that inhale and exhale, and also the point at which it intersects with the story that's already going on in the minds of your audience. To answer your question, it really depends on who is the audience that you want to move, because we have our truths and we have our story and we have our journey, but story is simply a bridge for transformation. It's that path of possibility that your audience gets to travel on because they got to hear your experience. So we ask ourselves, what is the journey that we want our audience? So, when I work with clients one-on-one and in my transformational story selling course, we go through these things called the sacred questions. And some of them are super hurty and vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that needs to be the story you tell. I would say, though, it is important to do the work to find out where your story came from, whether that's the story you tell or not. And I guess the second point is, oftentimes people will have a piece of their story that involves somebody else that they may or may not want to or be comfortable sharing. But going back to the definition of story, a story is a snapshot in time, your perspective in that snapshot, and what you make it mean. We have to ask ourselves, what is the meaning that this component of my story carries forward, so that I can convey to the audience, where I was emotionally at that time, why I felt the way I did, why I made the moves I did, why my perspective was the way it was in the moment. Sometimes it's not always specifically the thing that happened, but the meaning that the thing had. And with permission, I'll share, an example. I worked with a client that had experienced some childhood abuse, and it informed who she became and why, but it wasn't really relevant to, they would be hurty, they would be burdening the audience, and it wasn't the journey they wanted to take. She wanted to take them on. So what we simply did was we referred to it, and we've referred to it as a Me Too moment. So people got, oh, okay, I get what you're saying, I get the meaning, but it didn't cause such a pattern interrupt in the middle of the story that people weren't able to continue on the journey for the rest of the story with us. So it didn't cause an interruption, but it allowed the audience to say, oh, okay, I hear what you're saying, I get it, I get where you're coming from.
Can you, that's a great example. I was going to ask you to give one. Can you give another example of kind of the intersection that you alluded to? There's the signature story, and then there's some of the toolbox. And even Lewis House, since we've talked about him a couple of times, he still to this day on his webinars shows the picture of him in the hospital bed after playing football, and tells the same story about the first webinar and all the things. And this is, I don't know, this is a decade and a half after this has happened, but he still frames his experience that way, even though what you're listening to, what you're looking to buy from him today has nothing really to do with the fact that he had that rough time, had to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. Can you give us an example of kind of the intersection and how to draw that correlation? Because I think everybody has a personal story that can land with people. But I think the dots to our business, I think, is the challenging part for a lot of folks.
For sure. Robert Cialdini wrote a book called Influence. Yeah. And one of the factors of influence is reciprocity. And the idea is that if you give first, people will be inclined to give back to you in kind. Yep. So when we give first our vulnerability, and again, that doesn't mean to share all your hurty bits if that's not relevant to your story, but to give of yourself, because the audience knows when you're telling the whole truth. And there's a difference between saying something that's true and saying the truth. And the truth is palpable. People know it when they hear it. It's just super important to realize that when you share your true story, your truth, it does sort of vibrate, to get a little hippy dippy for you in a little bit. It does vibrate in a certain way, and it does translate in a certain way, and it lands in a certain way in the hearts and the minds of your audience. But what happens is and the reason Lewis continues to share that is because it opens his audience up. Whenever somebody shares something in that way, they're hearing your story, but they're feeling their story. Yeah. So the reason, Joseph Campbell wrote The Hero's Journey, and Chris Vogler from Disney, kind of massaged his work a little. But there is a very specific story arc. And when you tell a story in a certain way, it really does create that connectivity. And it really does, there is a point in the story that the audience will connect with you. And then that's when you're sort of like your audience. So what you need to understand first is who is your audience and where are they stuck? There are strategic reasons why, you know, if your audience is women who are trying something new, I'm making this up off the top of my head. If your audience is women who are trying something new, but are feeling super vulnerable and nervous and come from a background of non-empowerment, let's say.
Yeah.
There's a strategic reason you would tell a part of your story that perhaps speaks to unworthiness or speaks to something or some component in your story where you may have felt like that, because the details of your story, they're going to be hearing your story, but they're going to be feeling yours. And there will be a point in your story when you were afraid and tried it anyway. And that is the point when your audience not only is cheering for you, but they need you to win, because that's the point where they stopped and you kept going. So in their minds and in their hearts, they're going, oh man, like what might have happened to me if I said yes and if I kept going? So it's not so much in the details of what you're saying specifically, but in the lifeblood and of the meaning and the emotion or the sentiment of what you're saying, because that is what they're going to feel in their hearts.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think you're alluding to the inciting incident, I believe. But I want to talk about structure, because we've talked a little bit about how to kind of create that signature talk. We all have that story, you know, here's what was going on in my life, here's the decision I made, here's the perspective I had, and then kind of the toolbox that you talked about. From a structural standpoint, there is an art and a science to great storytelling. Can you walk us through at a high level how to put together something like that? And let's just filter it down to today's day and age in this audience where, you know, maybe I want to go on a Facebook Live and in 3 minutes, I need to create connection and then give them kind of a takeaway or an exercise. How do I structure Facebook Live, for example, to create that connection using your framework?
Yeah, well, I always say, like, start with the problem, but not the mask the problem wears, but what is the meaning of the problem? So for example, if somebody's having a problem getting started with something and they're like, oh, I'm busy, I'm procrastinating, you know that about your audience. The problem underneath that is they might actually be scared of something. They might be scared to start. So start with the problem, the overarching problem. And then, you know, and Stu McLaren talks about this as well. Give a story or an example, a real world example of a time or a lesson that you can share with them with respect to how you were like them, what you learned, how you solved it, and how you moved forward. So it really is a very simple framework. It's problem, story, solution, outcome.
Love it. So once you structure that, once you found your story, once you've gotten over some of the limiting beliefs that tell you your story doesn't matter, and you've learned how to structure that, then you've got to actually tell the story. And you've got to be open, and you've got to do it consistently. You've got to grow your audience through connecting with them via a story that leads them to an outcome or aspirational identity that they want to achieve through your product, which is the vehicle. It's not your offer. So how do you get comfortable sharing your story publicly? I know a lot of parentpreneurs out there who are like, I think I have a story, and like, I hate Facebook Lives, or, you know, my life's a mess. I don't want to just show everything. And how does someone overcome and get into the routine and the habit of positioning their story to the right people frequently enough so that it actually moves the needle and grows their business?
Great question. I would say it's important to do the work on your story to uncover it. So all of the background bits, because you're going to find as you get out there and you start building your business, you have to tell your story.
Yeah.
But if you're able to articulate sort of your story at the high level, the best way to get started is two things. I would say consistently doing micro topic stories. I gave myself a challenge whereby every day for 30 days, I was going to do a 60 to 90 second video. And I called mine brain jams. And I just kind of did it because I wasn't comfortable and I didn't want to be truthful.
Yep.
But I got more traction from those micro stories, and they were just little snippets, just one thought, one takeaway. Because when we do them consistently, we create trust, we create a belief, we also become the person who's reliable in the topic we're speaking about. So if you were to open up the hood of your audience and say, okay, like, what are they thinking? Where are they stuck? What are some things that they aspire to? What are some things that light them up? Where might they not be moving forward that they wish they were? And so on. just create a list of micro stories and look through your life's experience and ask yourself, like, when is a time when I could speak to that? When is a time when I experienced that? And what is like one small kernel that I could share? That's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is, if you're having a hard time basically delivering your entire story unscripted or in a one take performance, I would say do the work to uncover your story, but then have somebody interview you on your story, because you're familiar with who you are and where you came from and what moved the needle and where you got stuck. So let it be a conversation for a handful of times until you get comfortable enough with your story, because that does two things. It loosens the grip of that fear or the intimidation of, oh man, I have to tell my story and I hope I don't forget a line, or I hope I don't whatever. And it also allows you to become known for the topic in which you're an expert.
That's great. I know that's one of the takeaways. Your talk at Tribe Live in August was amazing. We don't have time to get into that. I want everybody, if there's a video of that somewhere, I want to put it in the summit notes here so people can watch your talk and just kind of watch you in your element, because it's amazing. But to what you just said, Stu McLaren talks a lot, and he said this at Tribe Live also, like, be known for one thing. Like, I do all these things in my business, and this is Stu talking here, but I'm known for membership sites, right? And we'll get into this too. Stu's actually going to be a guest here in a couple of days on this summit. So you're going to get to hear firsthand from him about that. But be known for something. And then I think, to your point, for those of us that do podcast interviews, or your story, you have your whole story, and whether you structure it really well or do it purposefully, the more conversations you have, the more times you're interviewed, the easier it is to pick the parts of the story that are relevant for the audience and really dial into that. So my advice to anybody out there who's looking to like create the frequency and build the story in a way that moves the needle in your business is just, you got to do the activity. But I think your tip, Shelli, on being interviewed and actually getting asked to tell the story in more of a conversational way versus just talking head, let's do this, is going to make you far more comfortable, and you're going to get that validation and those verbal cues, whether it's a podcast or video or anything.
Well, the thing is too, I wanted to add this too, that your story is a living, breathing thing, which means there isn't necessarily a point at which it's done. You know, it's evolving, like you're evolving as a human being. And I'll share this with you about Tribe Live. I was at Tribe Live the year before, and I was talking about story, and your story doesn't have to be an epic adventure or this big dramatic event. It's usually built around a phrase that sounds something like, and then I realized. And the most powerful stories are usually about the simplest things. But everybody the year previous said, well, that's really easy for you to say, Shelli. I don't have this fancy story where I went from a manicurist to a firefighter in 1,162 days. But I said to them, you don't like my story because of the way I told it. Yeah, it might have some interesting details, but you like it because of the way I told it, and nobody believed me. So, you know, when I had the opportunity to speak at Tribe Live, I thought, okay, I'm going to specifically not tell that story. I'm going to simply tell the story about how I was bullied as an 8-year-old kid. And I will share with you, it's a story that most of us have lived in some form or other. And the reaction that I had from the bullying story versus this quote unquote big fancy firefighter story was by a factor of 10 more impactful. Telling something as simple as getting bullied as a kid. I had women come up to me for the ensuing 2 days and share things that they had not shared with another human being before.
Wow.
But it comes down to that piece where it's like, if we allow people to see themselves in our story, you can literally watch people's shoulders drop and say, oh, you know, I'm listening. I'm hearing you because I'm just like you. I experienced or felt that as well. So I know that you're like me. So continue with your story because I'm along for the ride with you.
100%. I wasn't super familiar with your work until I heard that talk. And as soon as I heard it, that was one of the biggest takeaways for me at that event, not to go totally into Tribe Live and the experience. If you own a membership site, join Stu's thing and go to the event. It's incredible. It's a side note. But it just connected. It connected so well. And I had been very in my head historically in my business. And it really allowed me to go, all right, well, how do you connect, you know, that 18 inches between your heart and your head and actually create the story that moves the needle and not be so analytical and not build your business in a Google Doc that you don't start? How do you craft that story and how do you create those connection points? And so your talk was incredible. I want to ask you two final questions. For the parentpreneur out there who's struggling to find their story, just finish this sentence for me. If you're struggling to find your story, do blank first.
Ask yourself a time in your life when you said something like, and then I realized. They're going to be closer than you think. They're going to be smaller than you think. But at some point, you realized something, you noticed something, and then you did something different because of it. That is the bridge of possibility. It literally is as simple as that. You know something now that you didn't know before. It made a change in your life that had some sort of effect. And the truth is, those signature stories always have a point in them when someone says something like, and then I realized. Because who you were just before you realized it, and just before you made that transformation, it doesn't have to be a profound transformation. It could be as simple as saying no when you used to say yes. That is where your audience is now, and that is the bridge of possibility you get to walk them across.
And sometimes it doesn't even have to be tangible. It can be a perspective shift that caused that. And then, oh my gosh, now I see the world in this completely different way and all this opportunity. So it doesn't have to be a tangible thing, guys. If you're still struggling with it, there's got to be moments in time in your life where your perspective shifted, or you started to say yes instead of no, or something like that. Shelli, do you have what's the best way to capture that? I think a lot of this is a lot of inner work and kind of being self-reflective and being open and honest. What have you found in your work and with your clients, the best way to capture that information kind of in the brain dump phase before you connect the dots?
Yeah, well, I mean, I take my clients through something I call the sacred questions. And it's basically just a really deep dive, extensive list of asking yourself things like, what are things that I remember as a child? Because if you remember something decades later, you made it mean something. Again, because a story is that snapshot in time, your perspective, but what you made it mean. So it might be on the outside, like you were counting red Smarties. That might be the thing that your little person brain captured. But what was going on around you while you were doing that? Were you counting red, I'm just making this up, but were you counting red Smarties so you didn't have to listen to your parents fighting in the next room and it was just something to focus on? So start asking yourself, what are those memories that I remember? What are the things that broke my heart? What do I aspire to? What do I want my legacy to be? What will I regret if I never do? Start asking yourself those questions. And when you start to put it down on paper, you will start to notice a through line or something. You will notice your before and your after. You will notice that thing that you either realized or shaped you or caused you to be the way you are. And part of who you are is earning the right to talk about and to teach what you're talking about and teaching.
Where can our audience go to connect with you more closely online? You're not just an expert on this topic, but you model it really, really well as well. And I'd love for the audience to connect with you and watch you kind of do that, because this story, it's a process, and you can understand the framework, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of, like you said, it's a moving, breathing document. So the most long-winded question in the world, where can we go to follow your work more closely?
Absolutely. So if you want my 5-second story formula, you can go to shellivarela.com/freebie. And I'm everywhere on the internet at Shelli Varela, spelled SHELLIVARELA. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of the places.
Hashtag everywhere on the internet. We'll link all that stuff up. Maybe not every link on the internet, but we're going to link up the big ones that I know my audience will find you on and follow you. If you listen to this and you've picked up anything that Shelli's put down in terms of value, make sure you follow her. Like I said, I got to see her speak live and tell this story that she alluded to about being bullied as a kid. Impactful, amazing structure. And it connected you with Shelli, even if you did not know her at all. So watch what she does and then learn from her in terms of structure. With a great story and an ability to create connection, then you can build an audience. Shelli, I know you're just coming off knee surgery. I appreciate you making time, even though it was not the most convenient time for you. And thank you for sharing all your expertise with us today.
Oh my gosh, it was absolutely my pleasure. And thank you so much for not only your flexibility, but for the awesome work that you're doing in the world. I super appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon, Shelli.
All right, cheers.
Wait. Before you go, did you know that the most successful online businesses are built working in 90-day blocks, prioritizing only the big projects that truly drive revenue and fuel growth? If you want to make next quarter your best one yet, head over to nickmurphy.io/guide to grab your free copy of the 90-day Parentpreneur Planner. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here on the next episode of the Parentpreneur Podcast.